Today we are joined by Vincent Deluard, head of global macro at StoneX. Vincent Deluard is a macro analyst who takes a look at things in a way that not many other people do. And I think pretty soon you are going to get what I'm talking about. Vincent, so great to have you on Forward Guidance on Blockworks. We are filming this on the 11th of November, the day after a day we'll never forget, the day of 6.2% inflation rate on the CPI, highest inflation rate in 30 years. A lot of people, Vincent, have been saying that this will be transitory. They've been saying that for 6 months. Not you. You have been one who has persistently been focused on secular inflation, and you think that the decade of secular disinflation is behind us. Can you just briefly paint us a picture as to why that is?
Well, thanks for your kind words. And actually, I do think we will forget that day because there will be many other days like that. And maybe we look back at, 6% in 2021. That was the good old times. Thank you for pointing out that I've been really early. And I'm not saying that to pat myself in the back. In a way, I was so early, I was wrong. I've been writing and thinking about inflation for at least 3 years now. I remember being on a client call. So April 2020, I had a report called A Crazy But Logical Call for Stagflation. And I was on a client call and I mean, it almost went, good thing it was on Zoom, not in person. And I remember the client telling me by the end, well, if you're even half right, and my forecast was that inflation would be north of 5% by the end of 2021. If you're even half right, the world will collapse as we know it. And well, I guess I got one of these two calls right, the inflation part. I think we are at a secular inflection point. We had 40 years of disinflation, 40 years of foreign yields, 40 years of globalization, 40 years of rising margins, 40 years of falling tax rates. Many currents are turning, and we're entering one of these new, very long cycles. If you look at a very long-term chart of whether it's bond yields or inflation, it usually lasts for 40 to 50 years, and that's exactly where we are. And I think the inflation that we're seeing now initially was indeed base effect, then it morphed into commodity-driven stuff. Then it was the weird thing, right? The price of lumber, then the price of computer chip, used cars, and so forth. And now you see it pretty much everywhere in the CPI, and even the Fed is saying, well, this is not something I can fix. I cannot print chips. I cannot print cars. And behind that is really an acknowledgement that yes, this is structural. This is not going to go away. Personally, I think it's to some extent a good thing. I think we need a decade of inflation to deal with the generational issues that we have, to deal with the debt crisis that we have. It's very painful for asset holders, but after a decade of inflation like we had in the 70s, what did that create? The boom of the 80s, right? So it's almost like taking new medicine. Inflation is a hard medicine, but it is the medicine that we need. So I'm actually quite almost happy that we are seeing this inflation. My hope is that it can stay in that level, in that range. I think between 5 to 10% for a decade would be the sweet spot. A decade of 10% inflation, you wiped out more than half of U.S. public debt. You deal with the student debt crisis. So that would be the best case scenario. My concern is that it's gonna go higher, and I think it's too early to make that hyperinflation call. I'm not Jack Dorsey, but I do think there's a chance. Like historically, it's kind of, that's the problem with inflation is, if you keep it low, you anchor expectation, that's good, but it's hard to keep it hot. It's either, low or then it goes parabolic. Very few countries have been able to sustain 5-8% inflation for a decade, which I think would be the solution. So I think that's going to be the answer for the next decade. Is either way, it's going to be bad for traditional asset classes, especially bonds, but it could be completely disastrous if we are getting this hyperinflation scenario.
Vincent, can you just paint a picture of what, if 10% inflation happens over the next 10 years, paint us a picture of what that looks like for assets. U.S. Treasury bond, a 10-year Treasury bond, which now yields something like 1.5%. What does that look like if you're on nominal terms, you're earning 1.5%, but the currency in which you're being paid is being inflated away at 10% per year. Are yields going to rise, or are we going to be in extremely negative real rate territory that will be good for perhaps things like gold and Bitcoin and real assets?
Yeah, I would think more the latter. I think we're going to suffer from extreme financial repression, way stronger than what we experienced even the 70s. I mean, people talk about the 70s, and I wrote a report about stagflation about 2 years ago, comparing today's situation to the 70s. And one difference in the 70s, people make fun of Arthur Burns and the mistake that Nixon and price control, all these things, but in reality, rates rose fairly quickly in the 70s, and more often than not, you actually had positive real rates in the 70s. This disconnect right now, it's about 6% inflation, probably more like 10 if you really accounted for reset inflation correctly, with 1.5. So you're looking at minus 5.5% real rates. I mean, if we go to 10, as I suspect we might, these are really. I think there was a brief period just after the war. I think when we had to retool the economy to reaccommodate all the soldiers, and there was a Korean War. There's a brief period when inflation went double digits, and we had financial repression. But in the late 40s, early 50s, it did fix itself. So this was a very transitory period. I don't think we've ever experienced sustained, high single-digit inflation with depression level yields. And no, I don't really see yields as I think they should, obviously. If you just do a regression on where yields should be based on nominal GDP, we should be looking at 10% 10-year yield. We're at 1.5. So obviously they should. Doesn't mean that they will, right? Because obviously the Fed is going to try to contain them as much as possible. And then one thing that I think people get wrong about the bond market is that they keep thinking of the bond market as this kind of economic forecasting oracle, right? Oh, the bond market's never wrong. The bond market, when the yield curve inverts, there's a recession, or yada yada. So they try to think of like the bond market as some sort of a signal. Even the Fed does that. I think that's still the last part of the argument that's still holding is they can turn to the bond market and say, well, look, long-term yields are very, very low. So that means that, very smart people agree that this will be transitory. I mean, maybe in the 90s when you did have active investors, when you had, bond market vigilantes, but this is a different bond market today. I mean, so it's a market that's effectively nationalized. We have monetary theory. You also have a lot of actors that are buying long-term treasuries for reasons that are entirely uneconomical. I mean, pension funds would be a good example. Like we had this miracle rally in 2021, right, where pretty much every asset went up. And as a result, most American pension funds are now fully funded. So right now, if I were running a pension, I would just buy a 30-year treasury, lock it in, call it a day. Don't care. Yes, I'm going to lose minus 50 basis points in real yield if I would buy a treasury inflation protected security. But if I can lock in my funding ratio of 100% and just call it a day, yes. And the way you do that is with long-term treasuries. Same thing, for example, with China. We see these record surpluses in China, and the way the Chinese capital account works is that if you have a currency surplus, it eventually will flow through the PBOC, and then unless China wants the yuan to appreciate rapidly, which it does not, it will have to be invested in U.S. assets. So you have a lot of players in the bond market that are making purchases that have nothing to do with the inflation outlook. And I think one of the big mistakes that people make is they look at the yield curve and like, oh, look, it's almost flat, it's almost inverting. That means we're going to get a... No, that means nothing. It just means more buyers than sellers.
Vincent, don't you know the bond market is smart money? I've heard that many times, and I first definitely believed it. Now I have some questions about it. We'll get into that later. MMT, financial repression, especially you're in the weeds on inflation. We'll get into that later on in the interview, maybe 20 minutes later. But Vincent, now I want to turn to another idea, which is that everything is amazing, but nobody is happy. You mentioned that pension funds are fully funded for the first time in decades. That is only one of several extremely positive economic phenomena that not only would we have never expected it in March and April of 2020, but things are looking great even compared to pre-COVID levels. To give you a few examples, households' net worth has increased 31 trillion since March 2020. Tax collections are soaring by 18%, representing rising incomes. Corporations, like junk corporations, are getting to borrow at extremely low yields that are actually negative if you take into account inflation. They're getting to borrow at negative real yields. And yet, Vincent, you write that households are negative on the economy, just as negative on the economy as they were during the COVID recession. Consumer sentiment is close to an all-time low. People are worried that the sky is going to fall down. How do you square these two seemingly contradictory states of being?
Well, let me start with the everything is amazing part, and you've quoted a lot of the things that are amazing. To me, the craziest one, and I just want to restate it because it's such a mind-boggling number, is the increase in household net wealth. So there's this Fed's report called the Z1, the flow of funds, where they aggregate who owns what in the U.S. And they look at the household sector, and household sector is 31 trillion of a T, richer than we were a year ago. I mean, I can't even picture what 31 trillion is like. I mean, for comparison, from the top to the bottom in 08, we lost 10 trillion. So 31 trillion is basically 10 times the shock that we had during the great financial crisis, but positive. So, and it's not just about wealth, it's also about income. So the best measure, I believe, for the real-time health of American households' income is the daily treasury statement. So every day, when you and I get paid, a portion of a paycheck gets withheld, and that gets wired to the treasury. So this data, you have to mine it. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get it, but when you get it, you really get how people are making money right now, and it covers everybody. Now, if you look at personal without income tax correction, it's up by 18% more than last year. So 18% increase in your income, 31 trillion in your wealth. Even crazier than that, if you look at non-withheld personal income, which is the money you make from gigs like your YouTube or your OnlyFans account or Uber or whatever, gig income is up 80% since 2019. I mean, Americans are wealthier, they're making more money on a regular job, and the gig income is soaring. So to me, these are the craziest stats. This is a wealth boom that we've never really seen before. I think you're right to point that the mood is very grim. And if you look at the University of Michigan sentiment survey, we're back at the lows we were in March 2020, which makes no sense to me. The way we reconcile the two is, I think, by really asking ourselves, what does wealth do to you? For example, my home here has increased in value by 25% this past year. Now, every other home in the block has increased by 25%, even more in some other parts of the nation. So am I truly wealthier? I mean, no. I mean, I want to live in a home, right? So, I mean, it's just a number that went up. If anything, so homeowners are hedged against that because they own a home. But if you're a first-time home buyer, you're actually poorer because when you thought you could buy a home, well, you can't anymore. So that wealth is actually negative. And that's an issue I've always had with the wealth effect, from the Fed, the notion that by boosting the price of assets, we're going to stimulate consumption and we'll make people happier. Well, especially if you look at bonds. I mean, what does that mean if you boost the price of a bond? That means that you need to pay more for the same cash flow. So effectively, you're poorer. I mean, think of it in terms of like you're trying to retire and you want to buy an annuity, right? So what the Fed is telling you, well, that annuity that's going to give you like, $5,000 a month for the rest of your life, it used to cost, 500,000. Now it's going to be $1 million, and you should be happy about this. Of course not. So there's a lot of the wealth. I mean, the paper wealth, if we will, the nominal price of assets really does not translate into general happiness. And then the same is true with inflation, right? I mean, we are seeing these rapid wage gains, but inflation is at 6%. So, I mean, people are getting, pairs of 4 or 5%. They're still 1 or 2% behind. And also they feel it, right? In places that are very sensitive, like food, groceries, gas, their house. So, yeah, I mean, you can look at the CPI and say, well, look, there are things that are falling down, like, for example, higher education. But I don't think that's how people think of their wealth. Like, they don't think about, great, the cost of college books has gone down, I'm wealthier. Like, there's something more almost primal about the grocery bill. And then the third part is more of a, almost like a philosophical view. It's like, what makes you happy? And you can look at all the literature on happiness. And I mean, poverty is ugly. There's no question about that. But what it shows is wealth increase your happiness up to a certain level. It's around like $75 to $100,000, and then after that, the marginal value of an additional dollar on your happiness is very, very low. I mean, you can think of Jeff Bezos, right? I mean, what's even a billion for him? It's nothing, right? There's only so many private islands you can buy, so many hours in the day. So past a certain point, wealth does not contribute to happiness. What does contribute to happiness are things like having a sense of purpose, being in a community, having a solid family around you. And these are things that have been in terminal decline for many, many years. I mean, a lot of sociologists have been writing about the crisis, especially for white men. And with COVID, this has really gotten a lot worse. Like all the things that used to give people meaning, the workplace, just taking coffee with a colleague, well, you no longer do that. The schools, they were closed for 2 years. The churches, the political parties, I mean, pretty much every institution that used to create meaning for Americans is in decline. And I think that's one of the reasons why the mood is so grim and so sour. Even though, yes, the economy is doing better than it has since the end of the war.
Yes, you're right that the percentage of men without any close friends jumped from 3% to 15% during COVID, and that 23% of young men report having had no sexual relation in the past year. So, Vincent, I think there's this sort of phenomenon where everyone, if they're an investor, they're doing really well. Unless they've been buying TLT, pretty much everything other than TLT has been going up. Like ExxonMobil, that's gone up. Meme stocks gone up a ton. Tech stocks gone up a ton. Hyper growth stocks like the ARK, Cathie Wood stocks, they've done really well. There's really nothing that has done extremely poorly, but people's lives are nowhere near the same. They say that, conducting interviews, you're doing an interview over Zoom. That's just the same thing, but it's not. Like I have had wonderful interviews, Vincent, with you here on Blockworks as well as prior, but I think that they would be even better if we were in person. So I think there's this malaise that people have, but how does that malaise that is very emotional, very psychological, how does that translate into economic worries? Let's say I'm one of those men who doesn't have any close friends. How does that translate into my economic worry? It seems more of a social thing.
Well, no, I think you're right. It is a social thing, but I think eventually over time it leads to maybe even some of the inflation problems we talk about, mental health issues, for example. 40% of U.S. teenagers are struggling with anxiety and depression. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why they're not, rushing to get, jobs at McDonald's at, even though they raised the wage from, 7.5 to 10 or whatever, is because they don't want to. And at some point also it's almost like a muscle. You stop, if you don't exercise, you lose it. People have been living alone and increasingly, call it the metaverse, right? They no longer know how to interact, in the real world, nor do they like. It makes them anxious. And I think that's a structural change in the labor force. And one of the reasons, by the way, why the Fed is kind of wrong about the labor market. If you talk to like Neil Kashkari and some of the doves at the Fed, they tell you, well, we're not worrying about inflation until we get the unemployment rate back to 3.5, because in 2019 we're at 3.5 and we had no inflation. So I'm not going to worry. Well, we don't have 2019's labor market. We have 2021's labor market. A labor market where a lot more adults are suffering of addiction, a lot more teenagers suffer from anxiety. We also have a lot more obesity. You have, on the positive side, we also have a lot of people who retired early, who discovered different interests, who fired, right? Financially independent, retire early, especially the crypto community. So that just means that your pool of workers that are available and willing to, take a retail job. And I mean, a retail job is pretty miserable in general. I mean, if you worked as a cashier, I mean, it's backbreaking. You make no money. I mean, clients are bitchy. The bosses are horrible. You're treated like completely replaceable. And then on top of that, you have to like add the whole COVID police. Put your mask, and the Karens like, I don't want to put my. Like, yeah, people don't want to deal with that stuff. They just, I'm done. And I think that also creates that inflation. The fact that the labor force is kind of giving up and like, you know what? I'm not putting up with this stuff because I can't.
Vincent, I've heard the argument so many times that the fact that we're not back to full employment yet is a will be a damper on inflation because of the Phillips curve. Like when the unemployment rate is higher, that will mean that the inflation rate will be lower because the capital has more power. Companies have more power. They can dictate the price of labor. Unlike when the unemployment rate is really low, when workers can choose. But I'm saying workers have power now, and they are like not going back into the labor force because they don't want to, because they made so much money trading meme stocks, or because they've realized another purpose in life, that they don't want to work retail and earn low wages, admittedly wages that are a lot higher than what they were earning in 2019, but still relatively low wages. Tell me about what you're seeing in the job market. Like there's so many more jobs available than workers. Why do you think there will be sort of a wage price spiral that was similar to what we were seeing in the 1970s?
I think there's a huge difference between today and 2008. So 2008, we had kind of a serious situation, right? Big shock to the economy, unemployment rate skyrockets. And then, all these people needed to get a job. Like you have, even if you didn't like to flip burgers, you had to do it because otherwise you're going to lose your home, you're going to use health insurance. So, the labor market, it took a very long time, but eventually people went back to the workforce because they didn't have a choice. It's a different animal. I mean, I have this right now. If I lose my job at StoneX, which I hope I don't, I can just, go to uber.com, register, and I will be an Uber driver tomorrow. I can, DoorDash. If I were better looking, I could do some OnlyFans work. I could, start a podcast. I could do. So we have this entire economy that is really growing so fast, and that's why I was insisting early on the personal non-withheld income tax, which is the taxes that are paid by gig workers, by small entrepreneurs, and the growth here is incredible. I mean, this is doubling every 2 years. This year, the U.S. Treasury will collect more taxes from people doing gigs than they do corporate income tax, which used to be one of the largest sources of revenue for U.S. Treasury. And this is an area that the Fed is not watching or does not understand. All the surveys that they do, the BLS number, the BEA reports, all that stuff is based on people like you and I with regular job, 401k, good health benefits, and yada, yada. Well, this is not where the growth in the economy is. The growth is in the creative economy. And that gives power to labor because, look at the price of an Uber. You probably make more driving an Uber than you would flipping burgers at McDonald's. So until these two things converge, I really don't understand why people should go back to miserable retail jobs where they have absolutely no agency of their life, where they are treated like they're completely replaceable, instead of doing something that makes them passionate, gives them sense of meaning, and they can make more money.
So that means that because workers have so much more flexibility, the clearing price for labor is much higher than it is now. So contracts are not being signed, deals are not being done because the price is not high. Even though we've seen very high levels of inflation, it hasn't yet smelled like 100% of that wage to price spiral because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in some pockets of the economy, inflation is rising higher than wages. And this is like what the mainstream BLS reports, not your sort of more bespoke analysis. And some people are saying, Vincent, that because people's earnings are going up, but not as much as inflation is, that prices will be rejected, and that rising inflation will itself be a contractionary force and cause consumer spending to
Correct. So I think what you're telling me here is a version of high price cure high prices, right? That basically what happened in 2008. Remember, we had this boom in the economy in 06 or 07. People were making a lot of money, and then we had like $100 plus oil prices, $4 a gallon. We had a few months where inflation was running at 5-6%, and consumers had to cut back then but again, keep in mind that short-term rates were at 5.5%. People were carrying tremendous amount of credit card debt, tremendous amount of mortgage debt. So they really had to cut because they were over leveraged. Again, big difference here. I mean, the consumer has never been healthier. We have to go through this huge pile of wealth before what you described can happen. For a year, people were stuck at home, could not consume, and they were getting checks from the government. So if you look at the financial obligation ratio, like how much you have to pay on your credit card, your college debt, your student loan, and your mortgage to your income, it's at 9%, which is the lowest it's been since the Fed tracks the data since the 80s, partly because the rates are low, and also partly because households have rebuilt their finances, and also because they've got a lot of income in the past years. So Yes, eventually I think you will be right. Eventually people will have to cut. If we keep seeing inflation exceed wage gains, it's the only way. But we're not there yet. And also there's a psychological aspect. I'm thinking about Christmas coming up, for example. Like this might be the first Christmas, normal Christmas in 2 years. I mean, families are just aching to be together. And yes, okay, I'm not going to look at the price of toys when I go, Walmart or Target. I mean, this is the first time I'm going to be able to get my parents to come. And I want to have a nice Christmas, no matter what the cost or the Airbnb that I'm going to rent or whatever. And I think a lot of people are in that mentality, like we've had enough. And I think that's really also, like I had this sense, inflation is a state of mind. That is that when you boil down, I spend so much time reading about inflation, different models, the monetaries, the Friedman, it's always and everywhere monetary phenomenon. And then, you have all these different theories of, you know what, none of them work. And the reason they don't work is because inflation is a state of mind. It is really something happens in our collective brain. I want it all, and I want it now. And that is the real driver of inflation. And to some extent, I would even say further, inflation is inflationary. When you go to the store and you see that the shelves are empty, what does that do to you? Well, you're going to buy twice as much as you normally would because you worry that it's not going to be there tomorrow. So there is, and this is why the cycles earlier, we started the conversation about these very long cycles. Like, why are inflation and bond market cycles so long? Well, it's because they are self-reinforcing loops. So there is no mechanism to break them. Once you start getting into these inflation expectation spirals, it just keeps going for a very long time.
Yes, and you said inflation is inflationary. If inflation begets inflation, it is a reflexive loop in the same way that the stock market is a reflexive loop. I've seen Nvidia go up, 60% year over year for the past 10 years. So I feel very comfortable because it's a certain pattern. Likewise, if the price of milk is going up 5% month over month, I want to buy the milk now before it's 5% more expensive. So the purpose of saving is sort of there's no purpose to it if you're in a truly hyperinflationary environment. And as I'm sure you've been a student of hyperinflation in Germany, and it totally messed with people's heads where they would start referring to things as trillion. They'd be like, oh yeah, I have 2 trillion children. It's very psychological, very deep, affects you on a very deep level. Vincent, so household debt is very high on nominal levels, but household debt service payments as a percentage of personal income is low because of low interest rates, stimulus payments, soaring wages, and forced savings. Can you just speak to the wealth effect that Americans have had, or you could make it global if you'd like? It is definitely true that we've seen an enormous increase in household wealth. Here's a potential argument that, to me, honestly, is the only plausible argument that is a true deflationary wind, which is that wealth is very concentrated in very few hands. And if you're, Elon Musk and your wealth goes up $50 billion in a month, you're not going to spend $50 billion. You're probably not even going to spend $50 million. Whereas if you are, a working class person who's, sort of living paycheck to paycheck, and you get a payment of $1,000, you might even spend more than $1,000. So inequality is in itself deflationary, and you've been a stern critic of quantitative easing for its cause in causing wealth inequality. To what degree do you buy that argument?
I think it's probably the best argument, honestly, against inflation, and it's one of the reasons we have had so little inflation despite so much easing is because indeed the wealth gains have accrued to people who would not spend it. What's the inflationary effect of giving, another 50 billion to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos? So I'm fully on board with this. I do think that COVID has changed that, not fully yet, but to some extent. I mean, this is the first time that we saw the U.S. Treasury issue checks to people, or even in California, because of the recall, like Gavin Newsom sent $700 to buy off voters. I mean, this is, you can still say, well, it's ridiculous. Like, we're going to start the stimulus and look at how much money you're getting back, right? But it's the first time that we are seeing this happen. We are seeing wage gains at the low end. I mean, the labor market, for the first time in decades, has a shortage of low qualified workers, and I would say a surplus of. We have too many economists and too many ESG consultants and too many college educated white collared for what the economy actually needs. What we need right now are people to bus tables, to drive trucks, to clean the streets, pick up fruits, and we're not having that. So I do think that these trends are slowly changing, in part because of fiscal policy, and in part just because of look at the median age of truck drivers in the U.S. Because no one wants to do these jobs. They haven't been replaced, and now we don't really have it unless we want to open the immigration door, which I don't think there's much appetite for this. I think there's going to be that secular trend. We had I would say 40 years of wealth concentration, right, where the rich kept getting richer, the largest company kept getting bigger, and anyone who owned assets was doing better. I think the pendulum is swinging the other way, where we are moving towards maybe 10, 20, 30 years of distribution, and in a way that is good. I mean, we've had that. That's why I see a ray of light in this inflation. I mean, it is the world we lived in of higher and higher asset prices, increased wealth concentration, very low growth, and very deflation. Deflation was a dead end. I mean, this is a dead end that Europe has been in and Japan has been in. So this is our way out. It's painful, but I think once all is said and done, in 10 years, we'll be in much better shape than we are today.
Vincent, to propose another counter argument to you, I recently interviewed Eric Besmajian, who's on the deflationary side of the shop. He's very focused on demographics, and the argument goes that in places like Europe, places like Japan, the retiree to worker ratio has steadily gone up, and because more older people are consuming less and they're not working, that is a deflationary force. He sees that will continue in the U.S. Do you also see that as a force? Do you agree with that, or do you think it's true? It's just such nowhere near as important to the other forces you're talking about?
I think the relation between aging and inflation is very complex, and we tend to oversimplify it based on a sample of one, which is Japan. Oh, look at Japan is the oldest nation; they have the least inflation, so aging is deflationary. I need someone to walk me through how that's work. I mean, let's take the truck drivers. Right now, I think in 5 years, half of U.S. truck drivers will retire. And that's supposed to be deflationary because these guys are no longer going to work. I mean, to me, it's like, if you work, you produce, and then you produce more than you consume, usually because you save a little bit. Now, if you no longer work, you consume a little bit less. That's the demand argument. Like, yes, most people in retirement as they age, they don't travel as much, they don't, eat out, yada, but their production goes to zero. So, I mean, if you just think in terms of output as a function of capital and labor, I mean, as your stock of labor goes down, I mean, your ability to produce, drops faster than your consumption. So I think, I actually do think that aging is inflationary, especially in the U.S., by the way, where you have this massively dysfunctional healthcare system. Well, it's a very expensive place to die here. Most people think you spend as much in your last year of life in healthcare spending as you do throughout the rest of your life. So as we get a much larger population of people who are no longer working, but still consuming, and again, keep in mind, the boomers are wealthy, right? I mean, there's all this anger at boomers. Like, most of the wealth is in the boomers. So they will have very comfortable retirements that our generation is not going to get. So they will be able to take, cruise and, go to the all-you-can-eat buffets and all the things that, golf and all the things that boomers like to do.
Get Shirley Temples.
Yes.
Mint juleps.
Yes. That are no longer producing, and also that's going to have a huge healthcare liabilities in terms of, chronic conditions that have been made worse by COVID. So, no, I do think that aging is actually going to be inflationary, especially if you combine aging with a deeply squeezed labor market, which is what.
Yes, and then it's the fact that Social Security and Medicare are themselves tied to inflation.
Correct, and I'm glad you're pointing this out, because that's another flaw, I think, in the argument that people make. Well, we can't have a wage price spiral because we don't have unions anymore, right? I mean, one of the problems in the 70s was, inflation will go up, unions would negotiate that the pay increase would match inflation, and then because the cost structure went up, companies and that was a spiral, right? And it's true, like the unionization rate went from about 30% to like 6 or 7% today. But one thing we did not have, it was barely starting in the 70s, was Social Security, right? I mean, Social Security started in the, really 70s, 60s. And then we had this very young population. So there are a few people who retired. Today, about 40% of the U.S. labor force is retired or on disability. And when you're on Social Security, every year you get your COLA, cost of living adjustment. I think the last COLA that they got was 5.9%. So there is half of the labor force which is insulated from inflation. So when we go the argument high prices cure high prices, that's only going to play on less than half of the population at this point. So I think it's entirely possible that we get some sort of a wage price spiral, not because of unions, but because of the combination of a large portion of people retired, getting COLAs, and then the workers being able to switch over into the gig economy and regaining pricing power that way.
Vincent, you said that it's very unclear to what degree an aging population creates deflation, as many believe, or inflation. You've got a chart on the working population in China, and you wrote that from the 1985 to 2010, China's working age population was growing. However, it started to shrink, and it will for the next 30 years likely. To what degree was China's working age population inflationary for China? And if it was inflationary, did it export deflation, or was it deflationary and did it export deflation? Your thesis is that China will no longer, over the next 30 years, export deflation as it did for the past 3 decades.
All right, so allow me to go back a little bit in time because I think it's a crucial idea. So I would actually start in the 70s in China. So basically what happened is the Great Leap Forward ends. This was the worst man-made famine that we had. Millions die. And in 81, we had the one-child policy. So there's about 10 years in China in the 70s when you're no longer starving and you're still allowed to have children. So we had this massive baby boom in China in the 70s. Not just China, but across all of East Asia, 5, 6 kids a woman. This is when people were writing about the demographic time bomb and, we're going to run out of everything, yada, yada. So my point is, big youth bulge that's born in the 70s. Well, what happened to them in the 90s? Well, they need to find jobs. And this is the time when the Soviet Union is collapsing. This is the time when they had the Tiananmen riots, and the Chinese were a lot smarter than the Soviets. They saw that the way the economy was structured, it could not function. I mean, they were poorer than Africa. They didn't have the capacity to employ these, tens of millions of workers that were getting into the labor force. So they had this genius idea, which is, okay, we're going to completely change course. We're going to devalue the RMB, which was, it was a fixed exchange rate. They devalued by more than 80% between 1992 and 1994. And we're going to open up the economy. This is when you had the special economic zone around Shenzhen, because they understood quite correctly that the only way they could face address this huge bulge was building a ton of factories everywhere, becoming the manufacturing center of the world, and export this away. Manufacturing is the easiest way to get a lot of people working very quickly. So that's when China is starting to have these policies of depressing the exchange rate, subsidizing production, and building a lot of cheap stuff for the rest of the world. That was China at first, but then after the 98 financial crisis in East Asia, the entire continent did the same thing, right? The Korean won, the Thai baht, the Indonesian rupiah all lost more than 50%. And they all adopted the Chinese policies of okay, I'm going to keep my exchange rates too low, and I'm going to build my export industry so that I can give jobs to my population. Now, at the same time, this is when, for the first time, we saw in the West the term great moderation. I think 1995 is the first speech when the Fed mentions that. Now, central bankers being central bankers, they said, oh, it's because of us, because we're so smart. It's gone. Of course, it's not because of them. I mean, go to a Walmart, look where the stuff is made. Yeah, was not increasing in the 90s. The cost of everything that was produced in the US was going up, like healthcare, education. The reason it was the electronics, the toys, the durables, the stuff you buy at Walmart, right? Which was made in China. Yeah. So effectively, we had a world where half of the world, China plus, greater East Asia region, it's about 3 billion people, 2.5 billion, was subsidizing the other half. There was about $1 trillion surplus every year from Asia. That just meant that these people were working for free for the West, or for very low wages for the West. And they did not do that out of the goodness of their heart. They did that because they didn't have a choice, because they had this huge bulge. Now, things could not be any more different today, because 1981, this is when the one-child policy is implemented. So instead of having 6 kids, you fall to 1. And that's not just China, by the way. I think the country with the lowest reproduction ratio right now is South Korea. It's less than 1 child per woman in South Korea. So that means that your population halves every 25 years. I mean, this is again a kind of demographic collapse that the world has never experienced. I mean, maybe the pre-Columbian civilization in America when the Spanish arrived, but we're talking about that level of. So my point is that all these economies that had subsidized production certainly won't need to, because the workers are gone. The Chinese population, working age population, is going to shrink by 10 million workers every year. So they won't need to stimulate the economy. They don't need the factories anymore. They will have the labor shortages of their own. They won't need cheap currencies either. And I think that's one of the part where the consensus is wrong here is, Chinese growth is slowing. They will stimulate because every time in the past they stimulated, right? Every time growth fell below 5%, you see, $1 trillion stimulus from China. Not going to happen this time because they don't need to. They don't have millions of migrant workers to find jobs. If anything, it's the other problem. So what you're going to see is that instead of exporting deflation to the rest of the world, Asia is going to start to import inflation. And that is to me, that is the biggest change, the biggest reason why I think this inflation is going to last, because there is no solution. The solution would have to go back in time 40 years ago and start making baby with Chinese women. This is not going to happen. I mean, turning demography around, I mean, to their credit, Russia, Hungary, Poland, they understood that at Eastern Europe, because they had such a big demographic decline, they are trying very, very, very hard. And still, the best they can manage is to go from 1 to 1.5. And despite really, pro-natalist policies for 15 years. So before we can solve this problem, I'll probably be an old man.
Wow. I'll be an old man too. Vincent, so in the old world where there were the baby bulge in China, so many workers, they were producing goods at a fraction of the cost that they can make in America because of the wage differentials. They were earning so much more than American workers. As such, American workers, especially in manufacturing industries, shrank. So you had a higher structural unemployment. That itself was a deflationary force. And then there was a current account surplus in China. What did they do with that? They bought U.S. Treasury bonds. So that was put rates down. So in this new world where Chinese demographics are massively contractionary, and they are not so much in need of a very low earning a wage job, they're going to be consumers. And can you just walk us through how they will be how will they no longer export deflation? What were they were exporting deflation by making really cheap stuff, and now they won't do it. And also, I know I'm kind of rambling here, but why can't the markets just find another country that is further behind in the growth? Think like India, Africa.
Excellent questions. Let me start on China. So the supply of home in China is massively excessive, right? So that the way they were able to maintain growth after 2010 was to subsidize construction, and construction is about 20% of Chinese GDP. It could fall to less than 10, so they have to find an extra 10% of GDP growth. Maybe not I think they're going to slow down. Maybe I would expect over the next decade that China's growth path is going to follow the trajectory of Japan, so it's going to slow. But still, they have to make up for some of that growth from real estate. The only way they can make up for that is by increasing consumption, which there's plenty of room to do so. It's ridiculous for the how advanced the Chinese economy is today. The fact that consumption is less than 50% of GDP. In the US it's 80%. Where is the reservoir of growth in China if you look at it from a central planner? And the nice thing about China is that they can do stuff. Like if they see a problem, they can mobilize the state resources. If they realize, which I think they have, that the export is not going to work anymore because of tariffs, because they no longer have the manpower, that the real estate sector is collapsing, the only way that they can maintain a positive growth, I would say, is by dramatically increasing the share of consumption in GDP. So that means that instead of producing and not consuming, the Chinese are going to start consuming and not producing. So the other reason, the other inflationary channel, I think, is going to be free exchange rate. Contrary to the West, China is very worried about inflation. Again, they're communists. And communists know their history. I mean, they have many flaws, but they usually study Lenin. And Lenin, studying the French Revolution, knows that, if you want to keep power, you need to keep the price of bread low. And they're very, the Tiananmen riots, in the mind of the Chinese leadership is not about democracy. It's not about, being more like the West. It's about the fact that they had inflation in the late 80s in China, and they don't want that. And you actually see that in terms of monetary policies, right? In the West, everybody's gone full empty, right? And then China, on the other hand, has actually tightened. They're getting leverage in real estate. They're making it harder for banks to lend. So as the rest of the world kind of expands the money supply, China is contracting it, and the result is that it pushes the yuan higher. So, and which is good. The Chinese want a stronger yuan. They want the yuan to be a world reserve currency, and they want to be able to buy commodities for cheap. Like when they see high gas prices, again, keep on China, it's a big oil importer, right? So they need something to offset that. They need oil, right? So to that, they need a strong currency. China and East Asia in general is going to adopt strong currencies, and strong currencies mean that the stuff that we buy from them, which we can't replace, is just going to go higher. I mean, that's what we're seeing today. Like, where else are you going to go? Like, I mean, we don't make these things in the US anymore. We don't make chips. We don't, actually, it's a base level of chips. So it's going to go up not just.
We make potato chips.
Yes, I meant computer chips. It's going to go up, and the thing is going to go up. Like people say, well, I'll just go to Vietnam, or I'll just go to. Well, first of all, Vietnam is the size of a small province in China, right? So you don't really have this reservoir. And Vietnam has also grown very fast, and they are all rising together. Like the way I think about the East Asian continent is kind of like Europe in the 70s, when everybody pegs the Deutschmark, and then the French, the lira, the peso. I mean, we had to do depreciation, but in general, we had this like upward move of all European currencies. That's what's going to happen to East Asia, and that's going to be inflationary for the West. Now, going to your second question, can we find a new China? Yes, I believe so. I mean, I would call, I think it's actually Raoul Pal, your former boss, who either coined or popularized the term the monsoon countries. So basically, you look at around the Indian Ocean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, maybe some of the East African countries like Mozambique, Tanzania, Rwanda. These are the places where you actually had 10% plus growth for a decade now. These are the fastest growing economies in the world. These are also economies that are increasingly connected. The Indian Ocean is some sort of a Mediterranean Sea, if you will. Like you trade a lot, you have a lot of flows coming through Dubai, yada yada. So I'm quite bullish on that. The only thing I would say is look at the infrastructure. I mean, the beauty about China is that you had like third world wages and top-notch infrastructure. The airports, the roads. I mean, amazing effort that they built. This is not the case in East Africa or India. I mean, you still have like power shortages. The roads are clogged. I mean, Africa, especially, just the rivers, for example. One thing about China that's beautiful is you get this big, long river like the Yellow River, Yangtze-Kiang, that you can trade, connects the hinterland with the ports. You can move. If Shenzhen gets too expensive, you can move production to Wuhan, Chengdu, and then you can bring it that way. Africa is not like that. I mean, there's only one river, the Nile. It runs through a big desert, and they're fighting over it. So the infrastructure that you would need, which I assume over time will be built. I mean, that's what to some extent the Belt and Road Initiative is about. That I think the Chinese have understood that, but you have to build infrastructure before you can get the production going.
Thank you for that, Vincent. Now let's move on to your final point about why there won't be inflation. This is probably my favorite. I think it's the most entertaining point that you make. You write. Everyone talks about that deflation, that technology is deflationary, and that a particular evangelist of this view is Cathie Wood, a very successful investor of her series of ARK ETFs, of ARK Innovation. You write, at the end of the day, the most serious threat to inflation does not come from new normal deflationists like Lacey Hunt, but from technological evangelists such as Cathie Wood's, that new sources of cheap and abundant energy, new modes of transportation, soaring productivity could offset all of the inflation forces I described earlier. But then you proceed to explore several of the stocks that the ARKK ETF owns, such as Tesla, Coinbase, Roku, Spotify, and you note that they definitely increase the quality to consumers, but they don't actually decrease the price that much. Tell us about that.
Well, just look at the price of a Tesla. I mean, it's a $50,000 car. It's a great car. I'd love to have one, but it's not Like, it kind of have two kinds of innovation, right? You have the innovation that you build something new and cool, that's Tesla, or you have the innovation where you just make something that existed a lot cheaper and a lot better. Kind of like you can think about electricity or running water or a centralized heating system. Like this is not as cool, but it just allowed everything to be a lot more efficient. So it seems to me that a lot of the innovation that we had in the second industrial age was about making, just replacing animals with a combustion engine. That made things a lot more efficient. And it seems to me that the innovation that is exciting right now, the ARC innovation, ETF innovation, are about making really cool things, but expensive. Like, Tesla's a $50,000 car, or even if you look at entertainment, for example, even your Roku, your Netflix, Hulu, whatever. Yes, amazing, a boom of creativity, like almost like the British Renaissance of Elizabethan theatre. I think we'll look at some sort of a golden age in terms of cultural creation. So much better than the crap we used to get on cable TV. But you add I'm sure you're a millennial, right? I mean, you have Netflix, you have Hulu, you have HBO. If you have kids, you also need to have Disney Plus. I mean, you're paying already $100, which is more than the most expensive cable bundle. Now, of course, you're getting tremendous value out of this. No one would want to go back to cable. And also, by the way, in that bundle, I'm pretty sure, if Disney Plus increased, which Netflix did, that would be a good example. For example, Netflix, I think the basic was 12 to 15 about 2 quarters ago, and the number of subscribers went up.
Yeah.
And to me, that also speaks about the pricing power of these companies. Because they have these monopolies, because they earn these monopolies, right, through innovating, right? But again, Tesla is the only game in town for high-end electric vehicles. So they have a lot of pricing power. So to me, a lot of the innovation today is really about building new cool stuff rather than fixing problems, because again, there's no money in that. For example, you look at U.S. roads, there's been no innovation in the way we make roads for 50 years, and every 5 to 10 years you have to redo the road, and that's very expensive. No one wants to invest in that because there's no money in it. But that would be the kind of innovation of deflationary, as opposed to the kind of innovation we have today, which I would qualify as inflationary innovation.
Yeah, Vincent, you also list Coinbase, which is among ARKK's holdings. And I think, it's fair to say that Bitcoin as itself is a deflationary tour de force. There's only 21 million, there's the halving schedule and the like. But, the maintenance of the Bitcoin network and other cryptocurrencies involves a lot of energy. You note that Bitcoin mining consumes more electricity than Argentina, 7 times more than Google's global operations. Now, that can be clean energy, doesn't have to be dirty energy, as a lot of people say, but it's... It takes up energy, and that itself involves the transportation of energy and goods, which is inflationary. I want to propose a example to you, or a theory to you, Vincent, is that you said Netflix went from $12 to $15. That, of course, is an increase. It's an inflation. What if, though, the fact that it was $12 to begin with was a sign of just how deflationary things are, because maybe it cost $15 to produce it? Squid Game, it's not cheap. It's not like you and me talking over Riverside. That's a low budget production, but Squid Game cost a lot of money. So $12, the only way Netflix could sell that at $12 is because it was financed by cheap venture capital money and investors willing to swallow cash flow losses because of quantitative easing and negative interest rates. So what if actually the $12 to $15 inflation is itself a sort of correction of prior deflationary era?
It's spot on. I agree. And that's been, by the way, that was the business model of so much of the unicorns that we had. It's like, okay, we're gonna, we're gonna gain market share, right? We're gonna achieve scale. So we're gonna subsidize. Whether it's the little scooter, the Limes, or the even Uber, or Netflix, or the food delivery, the Blue Apron. We're gonna lose like $2 on every box we send. Because one day we'll have enough market share. Will be like, again, why did they do that? Is it just venture capitalists who are just like, oh, I want to subsidize the lifestyle of lazy millennials so that they don't have to cook and they can? No, of course not. It was not out of the kindness of VC's hearts. It's because they understand how market work, and the best way to make money is to have a monopoly. And the way you have a monopoly is you're the only game in town. Now, how do you prevent competition from coming in? Well, you undercut your price. And because you have deeper pocket than your competitors, eventually you'll kill them. I mean, this is the Rockefeller playbook. You give them a good sweat. So we've done that for 10 years, and we could do that because, again, we had all these deep pocket investors like SoftBank, like Saudi Arabia.
MBS, yeah.
Yes, all of that stuff. The money was flowing, and all you had to show was like top line growth, didn't care about profit. So for 10 years, we subsidized prices to millennials. And now, I mean, you've seen it, right? I mean, if you take an Uber, I mean, prices, I would say, have doubled almost on Uber. Netflix is rising. I mean, this was the plan. This was the plan all along. Like, they were never meant to operate at these massive losses. So yes, now we are going to start to see a true price. We had fake prices for 10 years in much of these unicorns, and I call that the millennial subsidy program, millennium lifestyle subsidy program. That's ended, and they have built the monopolies, or duopoly in the case of Uber and Lyft. And yes, they have achieved tremendous pricing power because, yes, only Netflix can produce Squid Game. And Squid Game is really, really, really good. And, if you haven't watched, you're not going to cancel before the end of the season. Again, we are in this position where people have built this, the moat concept, right? The Warren Buffett, you want to build a moat around your business. Now, why do you build a moat? It's so that you can increase prices later.
Vincent, now for our final topic in this discussion, I want to turn to a notion that it's above my head a little bit. It's about duration and the correlation between stocks and bonds. I actually talked about this with your former colleague, Warren Pies, and our mutual good friend. Can you explain the concept of duration? It might be simpler to explain it for bonds first, and then we'll explain it for equities.
So the mathematical definition of duration is the first derivative price with respect to interest rates, which really, in layman's term, how much price changes for a 1 basis point increase or decrease in interest rate. And maybe a more intuitive way to think about duration is the number of years it takes you to get your original investment back. So think about a 10-year bond. You get coupons every 6 months, right? So you're getting a little bit of money, and then you get the bulk of your money at the end. So the duration of a 10-year bond is usually around 9 years, right? A little bit less than 10 because you get your coupon, right? So in 9 years, you made a whole. And that's kind of this concept that I try to apply to the stock market. So I looked at the U.S. stocks, and I looked at their forecast of free cash flow. And if I could collect all the free cash flow for the next N years, how long would it take before I can buy back the company, how much I paid the current market price? So that's the concept I've used. And what I found is that for most companies, especially the growth one, but in general, the S&P 500 index is a growth index at this point, is more than 15 to 20 years. So the true duration of the stock market should be comparable to something like a TLT, the long-term treasuries ETF. And to me, that creates a lot of risk if and when rates rise, which I'm not calling. I think, we had this conversation before. I do expect financial repression to keep going. And I think one of the reasons why the stock market is not selling off, even though we are seeing this stock inflation is bad, is because long rates are not moving and the stock market is long duration. So even if the front end moves, which may happen, like we've seen in Canada, we've seen in Australia, it's possible that we will see, maybe the two-year increase. As long as the long end doesn't move, we can remain in this, I hate the term, but permanently high plateau of valuations.
Yes, so something like TLT, which owns 20 to 30-year treasury bonds, will have a duration of 20, 23. These are all bonds. You're applying your framework to stocks, and you're saying a company like Facebook has a higher duration because than an oil company, that most of the money they're going to make is in the next decade. Whereas for Facebook, the sky's the limit.
Facebook among the big tech, Meta among the big tech is the most how you like, right? Because people, they worry about antitrust, they worry about users leaving, Zuckerberg being a sociopathic robot. Facebook actually, I think if you go by the analyst estimate, in the next 10 years, Facebook should earn about $1 trillion free cash flow, which is about their market cap. And that is the exception for most of the big tech. Like if you look at Google, you're probably going to need like 20 years, and even further if you go like in Tesla, Nvidia. I mean, the higher the growth, the perceived growth, the longer the duration is the general rule. And Facebook is kind of a growthy value stock. It's a weird one. But certainly for the energy, you got it's part. I mean, most big, all major trade for like five, basically, okay, you're gonna have free cash flow for 4 years and then you're worthless, like a stranded
coal
assets.
company.
Yes. Coal company, yes.
Yes, and so there's if coal companies here, extremely short duration. You're gonna realize all that money in the next 4 or 5 years, maybe, if at all. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you say that hyper growth stocks like ARKK, going back to Kathy Wood's ETF, 99% of ARKK's holdings value will be realized after 2026. Hyper-growth stocks are a massive bet on duration. So when you buy ARKK, you're basically buying something that's even more TLT-like than TLT.
Correct. And that is my beef with, that would be my biggest criticism of the ARK ETF. A lot of people, try to say, oh, Tesla is a fraud, yada, all these things, the technologies. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to say, and I respect what Kathy Woods has accomplished. I mean, historically, she's been able to identify the disruptors, so maybe she has a point. I don't want to argue about technology. What I do want to argue about, because it's something I understand, is the duration, and that you are getting 99% of your value after years 2026 at a time when you have 6% inflation. And I'm not calling it right now, but at some point we'll see a massive upward trajectory in yields. And because by the way, that is what inflation does. I mean, if you go to a country with hyperinflation, if you go to Venezuela, if you go to Argentina, people don't make plans past the next 6 months. You cannot even enter a contract when you have like 20 to 30% inflation. Like, yes, okay, I'll get me the goods by the end of this month. Like, you cannot do this whole, but you know what? By 2050, I will have the best electrical vehicle market. I have a 90% market share, and my TAM is that much, and my customer LTV to customer acquisition cost is this. Like all this, like VC talk, would not happen in Venezuela or Argentina.
Vincent, you've got to invest in my company. My company's trading at only 4 times 2060 EBITDA. It's a steal. So, Vincent, now let's go down. I'm scrolling down to the other parts of your report, which, again, went over my head a little bit. You talk about the correlation of the long and short duration stocks with change in interest rates versus the correlation of long and short duration stocks with inflation rates. So, Vincent, talk to me about the correlations between stocks and bonds. If Tesla is, very similar to a 30 or 40, 50-year government bond, and you're bearish on government bonds, where does this play out? And then also, how does the value of bonds as a hedging tool diminish?
Yes, I think so. I think that's one of the big questions, probably more for 2022. But we've come from a period when the prices of stocks and bonds, long-term treasuries especially, moved in opposite direction. That's what people refer to when called risk on, risk off, right? When we had risk on day, everything was up, oil, stocks, emerging markets, and then the only asset that was going down was treasuries, and that's vice versa. So if you had a 60-40 portfolio where you own stocks and bonds, it was amazing because your stocks will go up, your bonds will go down, and vice versa, and as a result, the volatility was very, very low. I think this was a product of this era of low inflation, because when you don't have inflation, your biggest worry is growth, right? Oh, growth is not going to be as good. So, you sell equities to buy bonds. So that's why that happens. Conversely, when you start moving into secular inflation, then your biggest worry will be at some point that rates are going to rise. Oh, inflation is high. Eventually, the Fed's going to have to raise rates. As you increase the discount rate on stocks, the net present value of this future stream of cash flow goes down. And of course, as you increase rates, bond prices go down. That's the normal duration argument. And this is, by the way the world has worked. I would say that's the normal relation. This is the way the world was in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. It was really only after China entered the WTO that we started to see this correlation flip. So right now, the correlation is zero. If you look at the past year, the correlation between stocks and treasuries is zero. It went from minus 90% to zero. My expectation is that at some point in the next year, is going to flip positive and be increasingly positive. And that's going to be usually negative for asset managers in general, because that means that your portfolio is naturally balanced is no longer going to be balanced. You're going to have to find another asset to replace long-term treasuries. And it's going to be, I think, especially negative for the long-duration stocks, like the Teslas, like the ARK Innovation ETF, which will trade like a very, very long-duration bond at a time when interest rates are rising.
I just want to point out that this view is purely or close to purely based on macro. It's not based on the fundamentals of whether NVIDIA is this or Tesla is that. It's purely based on interest rates, right?
Correct. And thank you for stressing that. I am not. I think again to use another term from your former boss role, the age of disruption. I see these things. I'm not smart enough to really analyze them, but I would not discount them. I mean, I don't think this is all a bubble. I think we are seeing tremendous disruption, tremendous innovation across the economy. And some of these companies are really achieving amazing things, including crypto, for example. But again, my point is, like you said, your company trades for 5 times 2060 EBITDA. That works if you have very low yields and very flat curves. You can take these like moonshots, right? Which is what Elon Musk does so well. Oh, I'm gonna, because he has the luxury of time, if you will, and then of course the infinite resources that he has. But again, if you are in Argentina or Venezuela or even a regular country with 7-8% inflation, your time horizon just shrinks, and your ability to think for the long term, like these companies have done, like these VCs have done, is going to shrink as well.
Vincent, so if you're bearish on bonds and treasury bonds will be the death of these growth stocks, so to speak in an exaggerated way, what do you think about this? But the stocks are high quality. Own ARKK, own QQQ, own the NASDAQ, own these growth stocks and short the bonds. What do you think about that as a hedge?
Well, I think you have a bit of a duration mismatch, because I mean, if the purpose of the trade is to hedge against rising interest rates, which by the way I'm not calling for immediately. I think what's going to happen is extended period of severe financial repression. So you're not, your bond prices are not going to drop. You're just going to get 1.5% inflation is at 8.
Negative real
so
rates,
it's going to be stealth.
Negative real rates, yeah.
Yeah, like kind of like, for example, in Japan, like you had JGBs have never collapsed, right? They just have these very negative yields for a long time, so people just lost purchasing power in Germany or in Eastern Europe. I think Eastern Europe or Germany had negative rates for a decade now, even though inflation was positive. So that's more my outlook. But sorry, let me go back to your question. So
yes.
Duration mismatch. So assuming that what you want to hedge is the risk of rising rates, the problem is you're suggesting shorting bonds unless you go really far the curve, 30 years. The duration of the, for example, like LQD is 6 years, something like that, right?
Yeah.
High yield is 4 years. So less than 10 year, and then if you look at your ARK or your QQQ, you're probably looking at 30 to 40 year duration. So your portfolio is actually long duration that way. So that's why I would not be, unless you found a way maybe in futures to kind of like, fix that. I think you have more duration risk in the NASDAQ than you do in traditional bond funds like the AGG. Yeah.
Good point. The devil is in the details. What about long Qs, long ARKK, short TLT?
Well, okay, so TLT, you are at about 20 years duration. There's a part of me that just worries that over time, if we do see sustained inflation, which I think we will see, eventually you will see rates go up at the long end, and then these valuations will go into question. I mean, it's just...
That's why you're shorting the bonds, though, for the hedge.
Right. But, I mean, you're kind of getting to a... with bonds, you have this convexity thing, right? Because the bond price can never fall below zero, right? So past a certain level, like duration is not linear. If you will, like so the price drop as rates rise, it drops less and less as rates get higher and higher, right? Now, if I look at these long duration stocks, I mean, if I'm right on the macro outlook and we are getting, maybe inflation at 10% in a couple of years, and we are getting a moment where the central banks have to raise rates, and we have to contemplate, rates rising from like 6. I mean, the multiples on these stocks is so high that, I mean, you could see them drop by 80% easy. And I don't think you're going to make 80% on a short TLT position against that.
Fair point, Vincent. My final question is, again, returning to the psychological, which is that you're right, the fundamental driver of secular inflation right now is an insidious increase in our collective preference for the present. What did you mean? You're talking about the TLDR generation, you're talking about Twitter, you're talking about Tinder. Why are people focused on the present? And how have we been in a sort of a very forward-looking macro environment because discount rates are so low? We're looking to 2060 for again my EBITDA, which by the way is community adjusted EBITDA. So just paint a picture for that of the psychology, and then maybe we can put a chart up of the cumulative flows into the dividend yielding and dividend growth ETFs, showing that maybe things are about to change.
Yeah, so I think you're right. So we've lived in a period of, I would say, decrease, where the preference for the present has decreased, where people have been willing to fund longer ventures, have been willing to take risk, have been willing to tolerate losses for a very long period of time. And partly it was because money was abundant and cheap, maybe because growth was low as well. So it's like, well, if we only get like 1%, 2% GDP growth, if I'm able to grow at 3-4%, in 10 years, that's worth a lot more. And I think that was kind of this new normal era of low growth and easy money and very, very long investment horizons. I think this is changing. And maybe some part, I think, is COVID. I think COVID acted like a little bit of a wake-up call. People, great resignation. Like, what am I doing? Suddenly you get like 1 year to turn inside and reflect about your life. Like, why am I flipping burgers? Why do I do this job at the insurance company? Why am I away from my kids? Like, there's this sudden, like, almost a Buddhist-like experience. Like, I need to live in the present right now. I mean, I am finite. I am mortal, and I cannot, constantly push forward. Oh, I'm gonna make it, and that, what does that even mean? I'm gonna make it, and then my life is going to start when this. No, your life happens now, and I think this, our generation. I'm actually a geriatric millennial at this point, but Gen Zers, like everything in the way they consume, they want things to be immediate, right? I mean, Snapchat, the message, if you don't see it, it's gone. Tinder, you just like swipe. You don't even meet the person. I mean, you just, or TikTok, right? The format is so appealing, and so it's all about immediate reward. And it strikes me that we have this mentality of, people who want things in the here and now, and then at the same time, the companies that provide that trade for, like you said, 50 times community adjusted EBITDA for year 2050.
Yes. I think just especially millennials, maybe some Gen Z folks as well, people who are investors, they are very used to, they want gains. They have to say, oh, I own stocks. I'm up. I had a great day, 1.8%. No, not enough. I need to buy options. I need to be up 5% a day. Oh, I'm down 5%. Oh, that's fine. A little juice. And I mean, the world of crypto is, infamously volatile. So I think you're dead right about that. Vincent, thank you for coming on. You've been so generous with your time and insights. We really have gone on for a while, but I think we've covered some really important topics that I know will be of interest and value to the viewers. And it could be even worth giving this a second listen. Just but you got the viewers at home, you got to skip through what I say. Just go to your points. But Vincent, thank you so much. Where can people find you?
So I would say Twitter is the best. So it's my name, Vincent, Vincent Deluard, Deluard. You can follow me there. I respond to DM. I found that I have a high quality conversation on Twitter, and then there's a link under my pinned tweet to a registration form where you can sign up for a free trial of my work. So I write about one report a week, 10 pages. Usually covers the topic we discussed today: global macro, quant, flows, Europe. So that's one way you can follow my work, and then becoming a client of StoneX. We are a very large Fortune 100 company, broker dealer, very active in commodity futures, even Bitcoin now.
Interesting.
Securities.
Relevant to the audience, yeah.
Yes, we have offices all around the world, and clients that go from super large institution to retail. So and if you are already a client of StoneX, talk to your broker and try to get on my distribution list.
Definitely. The work is fantastic, Vincent. I love reading your reports. I always learned so much. Vincent, I've got a question. So you write a 10-pager once a week. What's your duration? What's the duration of your workflow? Are you a procrastinator, or are you someone who's like, I know what I want to write and I get it. You submit it early.
Well, I'm lucky that I get to talk to a lot of smart people from very different regions of the world. And that's something that really I'm grateful for StoneX is for historical reason. We have I talk to farmers in Kansas. I talk to coffee producers in Colombia. So I talk to crypto guys out of Hong Kong. I have my historical client base is, mostly based out of Europe, pension funds. So I really benefit from getting a lot of these perspectives and also the Twitter, by the way. I mean, so many amazing ideas, amazing conversation that I've been able to start Twitter, Real Vision. I met some fantastic people there as well.
That's how I met you. Yeah.
Yes. And then the more conversation you have, it kind of feeds into the report. And then it's just a matter of finding a couple of hours of completely undisturbed time. And then you get into a flow, you put the headset on, just write. And if you've done the work correctly, if you talk to the right people, if you have the right ideas, it just falls into place, and it's really beautiful thing. To me, it's one of the greatest jobs I could have done. So every day I'm grateful.
Yes. I know what you mean. I also am a content creator. I think maybe 1 in 10 I have such a harmonious creation experience, but other times I'm very stressed. So I have a lot to learn. Thank you again, Vincent, and thank you to everyone viewing. Stay tuned for the next episode, which will air on Friday.